Today, I invite you to reflect on a provocative idea. Why does America fear India's rise more than China's? Democracy has always been a word America uses as both a shield and a sword. It is the foundation of its global identity, the principle it claims to defend, and the narrative it relies on to justify its leadership in world affairs. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as the ultimate example of how freedom, liberty, and democracy can coexist with prosperity and power. Against authoritarian nations like China, the contrast is simple and convenient. America represents openness, while China embodies control. But when India rises, an India that is also democratic, it disrupts this black and white narrative and introduces a complexity that America is not entirely comfortable with. India, as the world's largest democracy, represents something far more threatening to American exceptionalism than China ever could. China's authoritarian model is easy to criticize. It can be portrayed as rigid, suppressive, and unsustainable in the long run. But India's rise demonstrates that prosperity and progress can emerge within a democratic framework similar to America's own. This matters because if India succeeds in lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, achieving technological breakthroughs, and sustaining growth, all while holding regular elections, maintaining a free press, and respecting diverse voices, it raises a very uncomfortable question: is America truly unique, or just one among many democracies that can thrive? What unsettles Washington is the possibility that India may offer an alternative to a democratic model, one that resonates even more strongly with nations of the global South. While American democracy has often been criticized for hypocrisy, interventionism, and double standards, India's democratic experiment is seen as messy but authentic. It represents the coexistence of multiple religions, languages, and cultures under one political system. For nations emerging from colonialism or struggling with diversity, this becomes a powerful example. If India proves that democracy can be inclusive and still fuel rapid development, America loses its monopoly on the democratic success story. The fear grows deeper when we look at India's human capital. India is not only democratic, it is young, with a median age under 30. Its population represents both a massive workforce and a pool of innovators. These are not just numbers on paper. They are people already shaping global industries, particularly in technology. A significant portion of America's own Silicon Valley is powered by Indian talent, CEOs of top companies, engineers driving innovation, and scientists pushing the boundaries of research. Now imagine when these same energies are unleashed within India itself, supported by democratic freedoms of expression and thought. Innovation thrives in openness, and this gives India a competitive edge that authoritarian systems cannot easily replicate. For America, this is a sobering realization. There is also a moral and ideological dimension. America has long claimed that its democratic system is not only superior but also universal. This belief has justified its interventions abroad, from wars to trade deals. Yet when India, a democracy outside the Western sphere, begins to rival America's influence, it disrupts that narrative. It shows that democracy does not have to be American-style democracy to succeed. It can be shaped by different histories, cultures, and values. And this is exactly what unsettles Washington, a rival that does not oppose democracy, but redefines it. Furthermore, America's fear of India's democratic rise is linked to its global alliances. When the United States points to China as a threat, it easily gathers allies under the banner of protecting democracy from authoritarianism. But if India, another democracy, grows powerful and independent, those same allies may start seeing multiple democratic centers of influence rather than just one. In that case, America's role as the leader of the free world becomes less certain. Nations may look to India for partnership, inspiration, or even leadership, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where America's credibility has often been questioned. This fear is not openly admitted, of course. In official rhetoric, America calls India its partner, praises its democracy, and emphasizes cooperation. But beneath the surface lies unease. For with every election India successfully conducts, every tech giant it produces, and every democratic institution it strengthens, India chips away at America's claim to exceptionalism. Unlike China, which can be easily cast as the other, India mirrors America's own values but stands ready to compete on equal terms. That is not a rivalry America can fight with ideology because India plays by the same rules. In essence, America fears India's rise not because it threatens democracy, but because it threatens to prove that democracy is not America's exclusive domain. A powerful, prosperous, democratic India proves that multiple models of freedom and progress can exist, each valid in its own right. And when that realization spreads, America's greatest asset, its moral authority, will no longer stand uncontested. India's democratic rise is therefore not just a geopolitical challenge, it is an ideological one. One of the most decisive elements shaping the future of nations is demographics. Population is not merely a number, it is the foundation of workforce, innovation, and consumption. In this regard, India stands at a unique and historic advantage that distinguishes it from China and places it in a position that deeply concerns the United States. While China's economic might has dominated global headlines for decades, its population story is turning into a challenge rather than an asset. An aging society, a shrinking workforce, and the long-term effects of the one-child policy are already beginning to weigh heavily on its prospects. India, in contrast, is surging forward with a demographic dividend, an unprecedented wave of young, educated, and ambitious citizens. This youthful energy is one of the primary reasons America quietly fears India's rise. The numbers speak for themselves. India has overtaken China as the most populous nation on earth, with more than 1.4 billion people. Unlike China, however, India's median age is under 30. This means that while China's population is rapidly graying, India's is entering its most productive phase. Millions of Indians are either joining or about to join the workforce, creating a massive engine for economic growth. This is not just about numbers filling jobs, it is about the sheer scale of potential consumers, entrepreneurs, and innovators who will shape global demand and supply chains in the 21st century. America, with its own aging population, knows very well that such demographic vitality is something it cannot replicate at home and it cannot stop abroad. But demographics are not only about population size, they are about quality. India is producing millions of engineers, doctors, researchers, and professionals every year. Its higher education system, while imperfect, is one of the largest in the world, and its graduates are already leading global industries. From the CEOs of multinational corporations to the developers powering the software industry, Indians are making their mark across borders. What makes this remarkable is that much of this talent was trained and educated within a democratic framework that allows freedom of expression, creativity, and innovation. Unlike authoritarian systems where ideas are often constrained by political control, India's youth operate in an environment that, despite its challenges, encourages experimentation. America sees in this the possibility of India not just matching but surpassing its own innovative capacity in key sectors like technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and renewable energy. The demographic story also has a global geopolitical angle. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia look at India's population advantage as a relatable and inspiring model. These regions are themselves young and diverse, and they see India's experience as more aligned with their realities than America's or China's. If India can harness its population to achieve broad-based development, it will become a leader and natural partner for much of the global South. For the United States, which has long sought to position itself as the global leader and model, this possibility is unsettling. The rise of India as a demographic powerhouse not only shifts the balance of economic power, but also reconfigures the global moral and political influence. Another dimension is the consumer market. A young, upwardly mobile population means rising demand for goods, services, and technology. India is on track to become one of the largest consumer markets in the world, rivaling the United States itself. For global corporations, this means the center of gravity for business and innovation is slowly moving away from the Western world toward Asia, with India at its heart. America understands that once companies and investors begin prioritizing India's market over its own, its economic dominance will further erode. Yet the fear goes beyond economics. A youthful, democratic, and ambitious India represents a vision of the future that America once embodied. The United States rose to global power in the 20th century not only because of its military and industrial might, but also because of its youthful energy, immigration-driven growth, and innovative spirit. Now, India mirrors that story at an even larger scale. For Washington, this is both a reminder of its past and a signal of its possible replacement in the future. The real anxiety, then, is not simply that India has more people. It is that India's people are young, skilled, and aspirational at the very moment when America and China are struggling with aging populations and slowing momentum. It is the fear that India could harness its demographics into sustained growth, innovation, and global influence, thereby challenging America's long-held dominance. Demography, after all, is destiny, and in this destiny, India holds a card that makes even the most powerful nations wary. One of the defining features of India's rise in the 21st century is its insistence on maintaining strategic independence. Unlike many nations that are drawn into the orbit of great powers, India has consistently resisted being labeled, contained, or controlled by any single bloc. This principle of independence in foreign policy is not new. It has roots in India's post-independence history of non-alignment, but its modern form carries far more weight as India grows into a major power. For the United States, this independence is both puzzling and unsettling. With China, Washington has a clear adversary to counter, one whose positions are predictable in their opposition. But with India, the challenge is far more complex. A country that shares democratic values with the U.S. engages in partnerships and yet refuses to submit to its strategic designs. India's balancing act is visible in its global relationships. On one hand, it has deepening ties with the United States through defense agreements, technology sharing, and participation in groupings like the Quad alongside Japan and Australia. These collaborations are often framed as part of a collective effort to counter China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. Yet, at the very same time, India maintains strong and historic ties with Russia. Even as Washington has pushed its allies to isolate Moscow, India has continued to purchase Russian energy, defense equipment, and maintain diplomatic engagement. For America, which thrives on building coalitions based on loyalty and alignment, India's refusal to pick sides is frustrating. It demonstrates that India is willing to work with the U.S., but not on America's terms. This independence extends beyond Russia. India has been strengthening trade and energy ties with the Middle East, engaging actively with African nations, and investing in South and Southeast Asia. Its foreign policy is rooted in pragmatism, not ideology. Unlike the United States, which often frames international relations in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism, India prioritizes interest development and long-term stability. For Washington, this creates a strategic dilemma. India cannot be neatly placed into the category of an ally, yet it cannot be treated as an adversary either. This ambiguous space makes it more difficult for the U.S. to exert influence or predict India's choices. The roots of this independence lie in India's civilizational identity and historical memory. Having experienced centuries of colonialism, India is deeply sensitive to external domination. Its political leaders, regardless of party, share a consensus that India must never allow itself to become a pawn in another nation's game. This has translated into a foreign policy doctrine that favors autonomy and multi-alignment over subservience to any superpower. When America looks at India, it sees a partner whose cooperation cannot be guaranteed and whose loyalty cannot be bought. That is precisely why Washington views India's rise with caution. The strategic independence also makes India unpredictable in global governance. For instance, India often supports reforms in international institutions like the United Nations and World Trade Organization that challenge the status quo, which is largely shaped by American interests. India advocates for a multipolar world where no single power dominates, directly undermining the idea of American primacy. This vision appeals to much of the global South, further boosting India's moral and political standing at the expense of the United States. In this sense, India's independence does not just keep Washington uneasy, it actively reshapes the global order in ways that reduce American influence. Another layer of this concern is military and defense policy. While India purchases advanced weapons from the United States, it also buys from Russia, Israel, and increasingly develops indigenous capabilities. This diversification ensures that India is never dependent on one source. For America, which often uses defense cooperation as a tool of leverage, India's self-reliance means that Washington cannot dictate terms as it might with smaller allies. In fact, India's push for domestic defense production through initiatives like Make in India signals a future where it may not need American military support at all. The fear that underlies Washington's thinking is that a strategically independent India is not just difficult to manage, it is a competitor for influence in regions where the U.S. has long held sway. Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia are becoming arenas where India's investments, diplomacy, and cultural connections are increasingly visible. These are the same regions where America has faced declining trust due to wars, interventions, or inconsistent policies. If India becomes a preferred partner in these areas, America risks losing not only strategic ground but also credibility. Strategic independence means India rises on its own terms. Unlike China, which can be confronted head-on as a rival, India occupies a more ambiguous but powerful space. It is simultaneously a partner and a competitor. For America, this is a more challenging dynamic to navigate. It cannot build its future foreign policy on the assumption that India will follow its lead, nor can it dismiss India as an enemy. The fear is not just about India's independence, but about what that independence represents: a future world where no single nation, not even the United States, can dictate the global agenda. Soft power is often underestimated in discussions about global influence, yet it is one of the most enduring forms of power a nation can wield. Unlike hard power, which is based on military might or economic coercion, soft power is about attraction, persuasion, and cultural resonance. It is the ability to win hearts and minds, to shape perceptions, and to inspire admiration rather than fear. India's rise is particularly striking in this regard because it is not only an economic or strategic story, but also a cultural one. For the United States, which has long relied on its soft power to maintain global leadership, India's growing influence in this domain poses a subtle but significant challenge. Unlike China, which struggles to export its culture in a way that resonates globally, India's soft power is organic, authentic, and deeply embedded in global consciousness. Indian culture has been globalized for centuries, long before the term itself existed. From yoga to Ayurveda, from its rich spiritual traditions to its cuisine, India has provided the world with practices and ideas that transcend politics and appeal directly to human well-being. Today, yoga is practiced in every major city across the globe, often more enthusiastically outside India than within. Ayurveda and holistic healing systems are gaining popularity in Western societies, increasingly disillusioned with industrialized healthcare. These are not products of state propaganda, but of cultural appeal rooted in thousands of years of civilizational heritage. This kind of influence cannot be manufactured, and it cannot be countered with traditional power plays. For Washington, it signals the rise of a rival whose appeal is deeply human and non-threatening, yet powerful. The Indian diaspora adds another dimension to this soft power. With millions of Indians living and thriving abroad, especially in the United States, Britain, Canada, and the Middle East, India's presence is felt globally through people who excel in academia, business, medicine, and technology. The success stories of Indian origin CEOs at global corporations, Nobel laureates, and political leaders create an image of India as a country of talent and resilience. These individuals act as cultural ambassadors, often unintentionally, showcasing the strength strength of Indian education values and adaptability. America itself is home to one of the largest and most influential Indian diasporas whose contributions to the U.S. economy and society cannot be ignored. This closeness makes India's soft power harder for Washington to resist and even harder to compete with. Entertainment is another pillar of India's cultural influence. Bollywood, with its colorful storytelling and music, has fans not just in South Asia but across Africa, the Middle East, and increasingly the West. Indian films and television shows are streamed globally, while Indian music and dance forms find their way into international festivals and pop culture. Unlike Hollywood, which often projects American values and lifestyles in ways that can be perceived as culturally imperialistic, Bollywood and regional Indian cinema present stories of love, family, resilience, and struggle that are relatable across cultures. This creates empathy and admiration, extending India's influence far beyond its borders. Language and literature further cement this reach. English, widely spoken and mastered in India, allows Indian writers, journalists, and academics to communicate with global audiences. At the same time, classical Indian languages and texts continue to inspire scholarly interest and cultural curiosity. Authors of Indian origin, from Salman Rushdie to Arundhati Roy, have left indelible marks on world literature, offering perspectives that challenge, provoke, and enrich global thought. This intellectual soft power contributes to shaping discourse in ways that align with India's identity. Perhaps most importantly, India's soft power is not seen as threatening. Unlike China, whose cultural exports are often tied to state propaganda and viewed with suspicion, India's offerings are embraced voluntarily. People practice yoga not because a government tells them to, but because it enriches their lives. Indian food is consumed worldwide not because of aggressive campaigns, but because of its diversity and flavor. This voluntary embrace makes India's influence more sustainable and far-reaching than that of nations that attempt to impose their culture. For the United States, this rise in India's soft power is troubling because it erodes one of America's strongest advantages. For much of the 20th century, American music, films, fashion, and lifestyle set the global standard, but as India increasingly offers alternative sources of inspiration, the monopoly of American culture weakens. This is especially significant in regions like Africa and Asia, where Indian culture already enjoys deep roots. If India can combine its growing economic and strategic power with its vast reservoir of soft power, it becomes not just a competitor, but an alternative leader of global thought and culture. The real fear, then, is that India's rise does not require confrontation to succeed. It does not need to challenge America openly. Through culture, diaspora, and shared human values, India gradually builds admiration and loyalty that America cannot easily replicate or counter. Soft power, subtle yet enduring, ensures that India's global influence will only grow stronger. And in this lies one of the quietest but most profound reasons why America views India's rise with unease. For the United States, competition on the world stage has always been easier when the rival could be clearly defined as an ideological opposite. During the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union, an authoritarian communist power that stood against everything America claimed to represent. In recent decades, China has assumed that role, framed in Washington's rhetoric as a surveillance-driven authoritarian state that threatens freedom, democracy, and open markets. This narrative works because it allows the U.S. to position itself as the natural alternative. But when it comes to India, the dynamic is entirely different. India is not an ideological opposite. It is a democracy, the world's largest one, and it shares many of the values the United States claims as its own. That is precisely why India's rise is more difficult for Washington to confront, because America cannot easily demonize a rival that reflects its own democratic principles. The difficulty begins with the image of India itself. Unlike China, which is often portrayed in the Western media as closed, opaque, and repressive, India is seen as open, vibrant, and pluralistic. It's messy but functioning democracy, its frequent elections, and its vocal press all paint a picture of a society that embraces freedom, even if imperfectly. For Washington, this creates an uncomfortable situation. How does one rally allies and global opinion against a country that is democratic, plural, and diverse? The old tools of propaganda, painting the opponent as oppressive or dangerous, simply do not work as effectively when applied to India. Instead of appearing as a threat, India often appears as an inspiration, especially for countries of the global south that see in it a relatable model of governance and development. This inability to demonize India also stems from the fact that its rise does not come through coercion but through participation and partnership. India is not attempting to build a closed economic system like China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is often criticized for debt traps and hidden strings. Instead, India's global engagement is marked by collaboration in technology, pharmaceuticals, renewable energy, and education. Its leadership in producing affordable vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, won admiration across continents. Such actions enhance India's reputation as a contributor to global well-being rather than as a threat. For America, used to positioning itself as the savior in times of crisis, India's ability to play a similar role complicates the story. It tells the world about its indispensability. Another factor that makes India difficult to frame as a rival is the shared democratic language. When India speaks of freedom, sovereignty, or human rights, it is not speaking a foreign ideological dialect. It is speaking the same language that America uses, but from its own perspective. This is problematic for Washington because it cannot simply dismiss Indian rhetoric as authoritarian posturing. If anything, it has to acknowledge that India's claims are legitimate even when they clash with American interests. The result is that America cannot discredit India without also undermining its own principles, a bind that does not exist with authoritarian rivals. The Indian diaspora in the United States further complicates matters. Millions of Indian Americans contribute significantly to America's economy, technology, politics, and culture. They are not outsiders but part of the American fabric, visible in universities, corporations, and even government. To demonize India would risk alienating a community that has become influential and respected within the United States itself. This is a sharp contrast with how Chinese influence is often framed domestically, where suspicion and hostility are more easily stoked. With India, the deep cultural and social integration makes demonization politically costly. America's unease also arises from the fact that India is not positioning itself as anti-American. Unlike past rivals, India does not define its success in opposition to the U.S. It seeks cooperation where interests align, even as it pursues independence where they do not. This approach makes India harder to cast as an enemy. It is not the threatening other, but a competitor in the same space, playing by rules similar to America's. This is, in many ways, a more dangerous rival because it competes on equal terms rather than from a different ideological ground. The larger fear is that India's success will challenge America not by contradicting its values but by excelling within them. If India proves that democracy, diversity, and openness can fuel long-term growth and innovation on a massive scale, then America is no longer the sole symbol of democratic success. Its claim to moral and political exceptionalism weakens. A rival that embodies similar ideals cannot be demonized without also undermining the very narrative America uses to justify its global leadership. In this lies the unique challenge India poses to Washington. It is not an adversary America can easily isolate or vilify. It is a rival whose legitimacy mirrors America's own. The more India rises, the more it blurs the lines between partnership and competition. And for the United States, that is a rivalry far more difficult to navigate than one with any authoritarian state. For more than 7 decades, the United States has positioned itself as the world's undisputed leader. Its economic power, military reach, cultural influence, and political model combined to create an image of supremacy that few dared to question. But supremacy is never permanent. History teaches us that great powers eventually face challengers who emerge with different strengths, new ideas, and fresh momentum. In today's global order, America often points to China as the primary challenger, yet beneath that rhetoric lies a quieter anxiety: India's rise. Unlike China, which can be cast as an authoritarian adversary, India represents a challenge that is harder to counter because it does not threaten America with opposition, it threatens America with replacement. India's rise as a powerful democracy with unmatched demographic energy and growing economic influence directly questions the United States' long-standing supremacy. The first aspect of this challenge is economic. America's dominance in the 20th century was built on its industrial might, its technological leadership, and its role as the world's largest consumer market. But India is steadily positioning itself as the next giant in these areas. Its population not only ensures a vast labor force, but also guarantees an enormous and expanding consumer base. Global corporations are increasingly looking to India not just as a low-cost production hub, but as a destination for investment, innovation, and growth. As companies shift supply chains away from China, India emerges as the natural alternative. If India manages to sustain high growth rates over the next few decades, it could rival or even surpass the U.S. economy in scale, eroding one of the main pillars of American supremacy. The second dimension lies in technology and innovation. America's global power has been reinforced by its role as the hub of cutting-edge research and development, from Silicon Valley to biotechnology. Yet India is rapidly catching up. It is already the world's largest provider of IT services and has one of the fastest growing startup ecosystems. Its engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs, many trained in or connected to the U.S., are fueling a domestic innovation wave. Moreover, India's youthful population gives it an edge in adapting to and driving technological revolutions in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and space exploration. When a democracy with more than 1 billion people begins to rival America in the very sectors that define the future, it signals a shift in the balance of global leadership. A third challenge comes from India's role in geopolitics. America's supremacy has often rested on its ability to shape alliances and set the global agenda. India, however, does not easily fit into these frameworks. It refuses to be a subordinate ally and instead asserts itself as an independent pole in a multipolar world by engaging with the U.S. while simultaneously maintaining strong ties with Russia, the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. India carves out its own sphere of influence. This challenges America's ability to dictate terms globally. If more nations begin to see India as a viable partner and leader, especially in the global South, America's claim to global primacy will weaken. Cultural influence further complicates the picture. For decades, American soft power, its films, music, and lifestyle gave it a psychological supremacy that extended far beyond economics and politics. But India's soft power is increasingly undeniable. Its diaspora shapes global business and politics, its culture resonates across continents, and its traditions of yoga, spirituality, and wellness command respect worldwide. This quiet but pervasive influence undermines America's cultural monopoly, particularly in regions where U.S. influence has waned due to wars or interventionist policies. Perhaps the deepest challenge India poses to American supremacy is ideological. America has long claimed to be the ultimate proof that democracy delivers prosperity and freedom. But if India succeeds in achieving global power while remaining democratic, diverse, and independent, it will shatter the illusion that America is exceptional. It will show that another democracy, larger and younger, can carry forward the same ideals while doing so with greater inclusivity and resilience. That is not just competition, it is symbolic displacement. The reality is that supremacy is not only about raw power, but also about perception. America is feared by some, admired by others, but always acknowledged as the leader. If India rises to a point where it commands similar acknowledgement, not as a rival authoritarian power, but but as a legitimate democratic leader, then America's unique position collapses. Supremacy cannot be shared. Once another nation occupies the same moral and strategic space, supremacy ends. This is why Washington's unease with India runs deeper than with China. China can be contained, opposed, and even vilified, but India cannot be so easily dismissed. It represents a model of success that challenges America from within the same ideological framework. The fear is not that India will topple America militarily or economically overnight, but that over time India will prove that the world no longer needs a single supreme power, and certainly not one based in Washington. America's supremacy has always relied on being seen as exceptional. India's rise threatens to make it ordinary.